Hello and welcome to One on One. I'm Vernon Ramesar, and I'm very pleased to say my guest today is Subhas Ramkhelawan, who's of course founder and managing director of Bourse Securities, former chairman of TNT Stock Exchange, and a former, of course, best known perhaps to many people as former independent senator. Welcome to the program, Mr. Ramkhelawan.
Thank you.
A great pleasure having you here. You obviously have a unique view of what's happening in our economy because of the nature of your work and the fact that you're also officially non-partisan. So you don't have any sort of slant one way or the other politically. Is it fair to say, and I think you've said this before, that we've been in a recession for some time and we're just now beginning to see some sort of action that would reflect the actions of a country that is in a recession?
Yes, well, we've been in decline for the past 3 years, and therefore we would have been officially in recession after two consecutive declines quarterly. So yes, we are on a downward trend, and at the end of the day, what we need to do to break out of the downward trend really is at the heart of the question.
Would the question be, I mean, basically that we need to, are we spending too much based on what we're bringing in? Is that ultimately the simple question?
Definitely, we are spending more than we are earning in this last fiscal year, where you had a budget expenditure of 60 billion and you had recurrent revenues of about 40 billion. This is excluding the one-off sales and whatever else we have been doing. So there is a gap, and that gap really is about 1/3 of the overall expenditure that has been budgeted. We wait now to see what is the actual projected expenditure for the year, which is quickly receding in terms of the fiscal year to September 30th.
Now, to get that margin sort of reduced, it's going to take a lot of pain, isn't it? I mean, we're talking about $20 billion thereabouts.
It is a daunting challenge for any administration. How do you close that gap? Now, over time, what has happened is expenditure has been allowed to balloon. And it was premised on revenues, high level of revenues, when oil was at or close to $100. We all know that oil is now at about $43, $44. So that has ratcheted down revenues, but it is more difficult to ratchet down expenditure to be able to close that fiscal gap, as we call it.
And of course, even though we had buoyant prices for energy, our output was in fact falling, but it was masked by the fact that the prices were rising so rapidly.
Yes, it really is a two-edged sword, because while we were experiencing a reduction in prices, and we are of course price takers, we are a very small producer in the scheme of things, both in terms of gas and in terms of oil. So we cannot, by our production, really influence the price of those two basic raw commodities. But the second lash, if you want to call it that, is volume, over which we have or ought to have some level of control. What has been happening, I think you would have heard the Honorable Prime Minister recently on television speak to the fact that over the past 10 years or so, our oil output has fallen from 143,000 barrels per day to 66,000 barrels per day. So we are now producing less than half than we were producing in the past decade or so. On the gas side, which I think is a more complex equation, in 2014, if you measure our production by the unit, which is standard cubic feet per day, we were producing 4.2, 4.3 billion standard cubic feet. And now we are in the order of 3.2 billion. So a significant scale down in terms of production volume, both in terms of oil and in terms of gas. Remember that energy basket really generates 40-45% of GDP in normal times. And so that there is a reaction that is taking place that now impacts the fiscal side. We as a nation generate a big chunk of our revenues, the largest proportion of our revenues from the energy basket. And because the energy basket has shrunk both in terms of production and price, in terms of value add, the impact is significant to the revenue side of the equation. Added to that, it may have been necessary to provide incentives to those who were exploring for oil and gas, which was actually done. And those incentives in the main provided for what you call accelerated allowances. So if you spend $1 on exploration, you will get to expense the entire dollar. What does that mean? That the bottom line of the oil producing companies would shrink, and therefore the taxes that they pay to the government would fall away. So you are caught between a rock and a hard place. One, you have to incentivize to get exploration going, but the cost of exploration is a deferral in terms of tax receipts at a time when tax receipts are in fact falling.
So even if, say, one of the big energy companies decided that they've really managed to get production ratcheted up hugely tomorrow,
yes,
we're not seeing anything out of that because of the concessions that were made.
Yes, and those concessions, actually, the current concessions would end in 2017. So you have a 2016 shortfall, which will feed into 2017 for exploration by these companies. So the question is, what do you do thereafter? What is the extent of the incentivizing, and what would be government policy in terms of seeking to ensure that exploration continues at a pace, because exploration leads to finds, and finds leads to more production.
But it's not going to ease us up in the short term, though, is basically what you're telling us.
No, it's not going to give us any fillip or any short-term benefit. And that is where the challenge will come in terms of creating a budget that is, on the one hand, equitable in terms of the distribution of the burden of adjustment. I have not used those words together in a very long time. Last time I recall using that was in the 1980s.
Right.
So it's almost it's a slightly different deja vu, but it is deja vu nevertheless. That what is happening, we have an economy that you can describe as a one-horse economy, oil and gas taken together. And when that horse limps, there is no other horse to pull us along, no matter how we want to couch it.
And many people will sometimes say that countries should be run like, governments should be run like companies. That is in fact not really the case, because there are subtle differences between the two. That being said, given your background in the stock market, etc., if you were being told of a company that was spending $60 billion and bringing in $40 billion, obviously the outlook for that company wouldn't be very good, and there would be called for massive and immediate restructuring, wouldn't there?
Well, I think the answer to that is a reserved yes. That recall that the expenditure was ratcheting up on certain expectations of revenue. Those expectations have fallen flat, and therefore now the challenge is to be able to bell the cat and adjust the expenditure side of the equation. That is easier said than done, because if you look at the pie of expenditure, you would see that most recent statistics that I looked at shows that transfers and subsidies amount to 53 to 57% of the overall expenditure. Now, if that is the case, how do you shave transfers and subsidies? If you break out the transfers and subsidies into their various subsectors, two would stand out. The social compact, which is pensions, which is support for the lower income grouping, which will be some areas of subsidies in terms of fuel. It will also be subsidies or grants or transfers to state enterprises that are loss-making entities. So there is very little, I think, that we can do in a difficult situation to cut back on the social expenditure side, because that in itself will create even more hardship and burdens to that segment of the population that can least afford it. In terms of fuel subsidies, the super gas is about level pegging now at the current prices, and the subsidy really is on diesel.
So
Now,
just to translate for people, that means that if you went to some other country that just had floating fuel prices based on the cost of
Yes.
oil, we're basically where we should be if we're one of those countries. It would be about the same price you'd be paying, right?
yes, for super.
Right, for super and for
For
premium.
super, the premium gas payer is actually subsidizing the government, a reverse subsidy, because he's actually paying more at the pump than the market prices. On diesel is a different case, whereas in diesel there is a subsidy. Now, think again what's happening in terms of that particular subsidy. Diesel is, shall we say the poor man's fuel, and I'll translate that. The maxi taxis who provide mass transportation in the main use diesel, fuel of choice and a lower cost. If you raise that, you have to face the specter of increased cost of transportation, increased cost of living, possibly for the most challenged of the group, which is the lower income grouping. That is not to say people like yourself, who may be well-heeled, do not travel on maxi taxis, but it is say
But it's
that
an
in the
option
main,
that we choose as opposed to something we have no choice over.
Correct.
Right. So that would, of course, lead to increased cost of living for these people because
Yes.
they'd have to pay out more for their transport.
So there was a time when oil prices and so on would have been at near $100, the 80s or $100. Our subsidies were in the order of $4 to $5 billion. That subsidy would fall probably now to about $1 billion or so. The initiative that I think provides the most sensible solution is the switch to CNG, which will be an efficient, a cost-efficient way of ensuring that you can provide for mass transport at what is a reasonable level or a reasonable cost, probably a little bit lower than what diesel is now, but I haven't checked my figures recently. But that is a transition that has to take place in the quickest order. So that
But that's
if
been talked about since Mr. Manning's time very early on. That was
it's
his pet
been
thing.
talked about, but I think some work has been going into it of late over the past 2 years or so. So it is something that is on the cusp of being delivered once there is the will in terms of what we do. So that's one area, that's this fuel subsidy area. Many people feel that there is a lot that can be squeezed out of that area, but it has to be traded off against what will be the ill impact on the society. Transfers and subsidies, the other area is the grants and the subsidies to the state enterprises. I believe that the state enterprises are in fact over bloated. We have created too many state enterprises that have not generated any benefit or net revenue to the country. And a company is an organism that must survive on the basis of being able to take care of itself, or else it is really an appendage of the public sector or the public service. Let us take a hard look at what needs to be rationalized in that area and see how much we can extract out of that area. Because when you have 50, 60 state enterprises, you have to have 50, 60 CEOs, you have 50, 60 financial controllers, 50, 60 compliance officers and so on. There is need to rationalize that area because we have used it as a way very often to circumvent much of the tenders and so on that would have had to go through the rather tortuous arrangements that we
Checks and
have.
balances or bureaucracy, yeah.
So that's a way that you get around it when you form infrastructural companies and education facilities companies and so on. But they are only expense generating. It might be more efficient to run certain projects and so through them. But the point is, let us look at rationalization. Let us see how we could get that. Now,
Rationalizing may also involve axing as well, right? Just removing some of
well,
these
rationalization, when it speaks to greater efficiency, might mean and probably will mean some cutbacks in
And I
those
think the
areas.
PM had said there are no sacred cows when it comes to those particular sort of agencies, that he's looking at everything, and if they go, they go.
And so we must, as a nation.
Now, this is all obviously on the expense side. I think a lot of people are actually worried when it comes to the upcoming budget, the average person, about the income side. because then we're talking about taxes. But that's a sort of a delicate dance, isn't it? In a very sort of stagnant, if not declining economy, you don't want to be overtaxing.
Well, on the revenue side, and maybe we should talk a little bit more about the other expenses, because wages and salaries make up about 15% of the overall expenditure pot. There is not much that you could do about that in terms of having to pay wages and salaries, but there is a pool of contract employees within the public sector, and they have suffered quite substantially because of cutbacks, non-renewals, and so on. I think the last figure I heard was something like about 11,000 contractual workers within the public sector. It is much more difficult to really touch the permanent public servant. So that area, I think the goods and services, believe it or not, is about, in the teens as part of the overall pot of expenditure. So you are not going to get much in terms of when you start to squeeze, except for what do you do with the state enterprises, except for some of the areas where you can you can reduce subsidies. Now, apart from the fuel subsidy, electricity is subsidized, and you will have to take a hard look. We will have to take a hard look at what is happening with electricity. Water is subsidized. We have not heard of WASA making a profit since God was a boy.
Yeah. Although attempts were made over the many decades.
Attempts were made. So you have water, you have electricity. Those are areas that you might have to look at in terms of reducing the extent of subsidies. So now to the revenue side. We have spoken about the significant reduction in the tax take from oil and gas, and that will continue into the 2017 budget. There's not much that can be done. So when you start to look at the arithmetic, in the short term, the challenge is to really ratchet up revenues as well as to grow the economy. Now, the one short, fast area to get the economy going back up is to increase production in the oil and gas sector, particularly gas. And we've heard some good news about what's going to happen over the next year and a half in terms of increasing natural gas output back to the levels.
Yeah.
So you have Juniper, you have Sircan, you have the truck or the compression project. Those are three that stand out. And with these, we can bring back up production, gross production, up to the 2014 levels of $4.2 billion. And I say gross because there is depletion in the producing wells. So that if you say I'm going to add $1 billion, what is happening with the rate of depletion? So what will be the net increase as opposed to the gross increase? So one is going up while the other is gradually going down, right? Correct. That's point one. And that really is also a short-term kick, maybe for a year or two, because of the rate of depletion. The big challenge that we have as you think going out from year 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, is that we are experiencing a depletion of our reserves because we are not finding, as at this point in time, new gas and new oil. And that is why I think the last administration did a very good job at incentivizing and bringing to the table exploration, because I believe the last administration awarded some 20 odd blocks, if my memory serves me right. And in 2 bid rounds before, there was very little that happened. So that is a good sign. However, from the award of these blocks and the commencement of exploration to monetization or commercialization, it could take you 7 to 10 years. So there's quite a large gap that has to be filled as we go forward. So you might get that fillip that good vitamin B shot. But remember, that is not long-lived. It is not structural. It is something that is going to take you up, but after a little while, it is going to wear off. I'm speaking about the short-term increase in production, the rate of depletion, and the fact that we have not added to our reserves for the long term. Now, add that to a longer-term scenario about investment as we feed into investment. No significant investor who's going to bring $1 billion or $2 billion US outside of exploration. I'm speaking about projects, about converting gas to some second derivative, whether it be methanol, whether it be ammonia, whether it be my favorite story, which is polyolefins, which is plastic. Nobody is going to come and put that there because their payback period usually is in the order of 15 years. And when you work back, you would want to know that there is sufficient gas over the next 15 years as feedstock for the project to provide the payback and the return of investors. So I've talked about the spectrum from short, 1 year, 2 year, going out to 7, 8, 9, 10 years and out to 15 years.
In terms of the investment potential you talked about, isn't it also the fact the world has changed a little bit? And for example, the US is now a massive producer of energy itself. And if you're going to be making a plastics plant, well, and you're going to ship the products to the US, well, if you're getting the gas there at about the same price, might as well build it there. So we've lost a little bit of a competitive advantage.
Well, we are losing the competitive advantage in the area of methanol in particular. As you know, we are the largest producer exporter of methanol in the world. It's our largest production, rated 6.2 million tons per year. Now, what is happening is the US is becoming self-sufficient on the next 2 to 3 years based on the projections that have been made available. The US is going to actually be exporting methanol. And this creates a massive challenge for our own local methanol producers. Do you continue to produce and ship methanol in its raw state, or do you take methanol further degrees, as we like to say, downstream, okay, value add in terms of integration to produce plastics that can then spawn a second manufacturing sector? We are in danger, and I'm speaking strategically as I talk out to the medium to long term. We are in danger because of the fact that commodity prices could fall, and we could find ourselves seeking markets and being not as competitive because of exactly what is happening in the US, shale gas and gas used for methanol and so on. So we need to find better utilization and greater value add. And one of the things that I am very focused on, and I believe our nation should be very focused on, is how do we build that second manufacturing sector. Now, as it stands, manufacturing is just about 5.5% to 6% of GDP. If you look at other countries that have been extremely successful, that are level pegging with us or started with us, they have done that by having manufacturing being 15, 16, 17% of GDP, and it is not. And also, much of our manufacturing that is taking place is really based on extensive importation of raw materials. And we need in that second manufacturing sector to have raw materials on the ground, which will then make us competitive. So that the challenge is how to break into the markets and how to add value. Another aspect of the manufacturing sector, and I hope I'm not going too far.
Which you mentioned, about 2 minutes left.
Yes.
Yeah. So go ahead.
So another aspect of the manufacturing sector is the employment capital ratio. Higher employment per dollar spent. But the first thing is to get that raw material on the ground. And I'm arguing that it has to be a strong focus on plastics, because it then also helps to build your financial and capital market sector. Getting plastics on the ground might cost you, excluding methanol plant production, because you take methanol and feed it into producing the derivatives. We already have those plants on the ground. So getting that to plastics might cost you 1.2 to 1.5 billion US dollars. But when you get that plastic on the ground, the manufacturing plants will be of a smaller order, 20 million US, 10, 15 for whatever is being produced. And it means that our local financial capital markets can in fact support those kinds of projects and build out those kinds of projects. It also means that we will be importing technology and know-how for these various types of manufacturing. It is the shortest route, in my respectful view, in terms of giving some sort of kick and fillip to the sector. Not all of what can be produced in a plastic plant can be utilized here. A lot of it will have to be exported, but it then leaves the raw material on the ground for you to start building out that manufacturing sector.
Sort of interesting, back to the movie The Graduate way back when the famous line, "The future is in plastics, my boy."
Yes,
You're saying that's a
it
future
still
opportunity.
is. It still is, and the demand is growing as countries become wealthier across the world. You find that plastics is an integral part of lifestyle.
Subhas Ramkhelawan, thank you so much for being on the program. I got some real insights, and it's been a tremendous pleasure having you on. Please don't be a stranger.
Thank you for
Thank
your
you so
time.
much for being here. Thank you. You've been watching One on One. Join us again tomorrow for another edition.